The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
The name of the book, Secrets of Silicon Valley. The author is Deborah Piscione. Deborah Piscione, you write that Silicon Valley is its own unique ecosystem.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a very distinctive culture that is based on collaboration, cooperation, and consensus. And I know sitting here in Washington, D.C., that's quite a foreign concept. But while many people have discussed elements of Silicon Valley, what I did is take a step back. And being an outsider and coming to Silicon Valley, it gave me the unique perspective to really draw in and say, what is it that makes this culture connect? And it is this ecosystem where you have your educational institutions such as Stanford University, you have your venture capitalists, you have your service providers, your lawyers, your bankers, your accountants, that sort of thing, your entrepreneurs, and many other factors that really make up this ecosystem, and where people become involved in the process of an entrepreneur's idea from start to finish. And that's what makes it so unique, is there's such engagement at so many different levels.
You go on to write that there is something in the air here between Stanford and Palo Alto, Google and Mountain View, and Apple in Cupertino.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's really what I tried to capture the essence of. And again, really looking at it from an outsider's perspective of what would somebody want to know about Silicon Valley if they had never been there? What can they learn from it? So I'm often asked, who is this book for? And it's really for entrepreneurs, to people who are interested in how Silicon Valley works, but all the way up to, of course, corporate America and government, who can learn from the unique way of this bubble-based economy that Silicon Valley is based on, meaning that if you're trying to generate as a government and you're looking for ways to generate new revenue, Silicon Valley has the answers. If you're trying to explore and ignite better innovation within your companies, Silicon Valley has the answers. And then from an entrepreneur standpoint, how is entrepreneurship different in Silicon Valley than other places, which it distinctly is? Because so much of it is often based on failure and learning from one's experiences. But it's also recognizing that you can be part of the process of adopting other people's ideas, or you may have the idea for the next big thing. But the bottom line is there's an authenticity to the way that things are done in Silicon Valley that's very accepted, no matter who you are.
You go on to write in Secrets of Silicon Valley that failure is a badge of honor.
Yeah, it is. And I have to say, I'm not completely convinced across the board. I don't think any investor wants to go into an investment knowing that that entrepreneur is going to fail. But there is a batting average in Silicon Valley. Most venture capitalists will tell you out of 10, investments that they make, they'll hope for one big hit, 3 that will do okay, and the rest probably will fail. But when you're talking about an individual angel investor, which is how I got my initial investment, I don't think she went into this investment wanting to fail and losing $5 million, which she did invest in my company.
Did she lose it?
No, she hasn't lost it. Yeah.
Deborah Piscione, how did Silicon Valley develop?
That is such a fantastic story because it's a vast story, and not one person owns that story. So when I was researching for this book, and people would find out that I was working on this book, people would say, do you go back to the 1950s when that's really the electronics industry, and certainly semiconductors that followed really started to evolve. But I go all the way back and looking at the efforts of Leland Stanford, who was the founder of Stanford University, and the commitment he made in recognizing that students needed to have direct usefulness in life. And he felt that science was the vanguard, and it was something that was ignored by East Coast universities. So he was looking to build something very different. But on top of that, what Leland Stanford did was he made sure that there was connectivity between Stanford and the surrounding industry, the very little that there was during that time, in addition to professors getting involved in civic engagements as well, be on the board of planning commissions, and really having a voice in the development of Palo Alto and the surrounding community. And then from there, I think, I definitely identify the leading factors that create Silicon Valley. but I think that William Shockley and the whole spin-out culture, the treacherous eight, there was 8 guys that came to work for William Shockley at Shockley Semiconductors who got a little fed up with his management style and also wanted to continue down this path of working on semiconductors. They had all worked at Bell Labs together in New Jersey, and William Shockley couldn't quite make up his mind what he wanted to do. So these guys explored what really became the first venture capital investment, although they didn't know that at the time, and it certainly wasn't what they were planning on doing. What they thought they were going to do was to become part of a new business unit of an existing company. But really what they did was develop Fairchild Semiconductor, and out of those companies spun out other companies, and out of those companies, those original co-founders that were all involved in Shockley Semiconductor, they estimate up to 130 companies that have come out of it. And what it did was it made it very acceptable to be able to spin out, be dissatisfied or have a great idea one day and be able to start a company the next.
Who was Leland Stanford, and how did Stanford University come about?
Well, unfortunately, it was over tragic events. So Leland Stanford actually first made his money. He came west during the gold rush, but he didn't make money actually in gold. He made his first, batch of money really supplying miners with the tools that they needed. But he realized that the West was going to expand dramatically. And so he recognized that railroads, they needed transportation, they needed infrastructure. So he was a railroad baroness who made an absolute fortune, and then eventually ran for governor and got very, very involved in California, very involved at the federal level. And then, unfortunately, he and his wife Jane, who had waited to have their child, Leland Jr., they actually had him Leland was 44 years old, Jane was 39 years old, and just prior to Leland Jr.'s 16th birthday, he unfortunately contracted typhoid fever and then died in Florence, Italy. So it was a really tragic event. So the Stanfords looked for an opportunity to really commemorate their son, and they wanted to figure out how can all of California's children be their children? How can they best serve this growing Western population in a way that would commemorate their son? And out came the birth is Leland Stanford Jr. University.
And Herbert Hoover was the first graduate, or the first student at Stanford.
Yeah,
right?
And the interesting story there is he's deemed the first student because he actually moved into the dorm first.
Deborah Perry Piscione, can you underestimate the importance of Stanford to Silicon Valley?
No, you truly can't. When we first moved there, we had been living in Washington, D.C. area for 18 years and moved out there less than 7 years ago. And people kept asking me, don't you want your kids to go to Stanford? And I'd say, no, I want my kids to go back to East Coast schools, let them learn, let them get entrenched in those cultures and understand what it's like to live in those difficult winters. And it was just an academic environment that I was used to since I was schooled on the East Coast. Now living there for nearly 7 years, it is unparalleled, the collaborative environment that Stanford provides. It's so based in collaboration and students working together that professors actually have to document on their syllabus when students can't work together. And the interesting thing is not just this continued foresight of collaboration and this commitment towards science and now engineering and technology, but also how Stanford works with the border, the surrounding community, but also works with the next generation of kids. The opportunity for K through 12 kids, starting with being nursery school, is just remarkable that Silicon Valley kids have this additional advantage, I think, of being raised in the area, irrespective of what their socioeconomic status is, of having the exposure to the religion and the support of entrepreneurship. And I think most kids who attend Stanford University, young adults, have some desire to do some form of entrepreneurship, whether it's their company themselves or working in a startup. So it very much dictates that kind of culture.
In your book, Secrets of Silicon Valley, here's a quote. In Washington, you write, I was indoctrinated into the philosophy of destroy your enemy, eat your young. While I am grateful for the how to win skills that serve me well today, I was sold a bill of goods. I didn't really do anything because most people in Washington, D.C. don't do anything except opine and deliberate over the latest, often inconsequential political and or policy spin.
Yes. And so, I have a great love for Washington, D.C. I think it's an extraordinary place. But I did spend almost 18 years being an observer, and now I've been a creator, now having created 3 companies in nearly 6 years. And I think the difference is that the importance of which side of the political aisle you're on, who you support, which issue are you going to put forth, trumps anything that would foster a collaborative and a creative environment. So I went from this environment of people asking me, well, who do you work for, to what's your passion and how can I help you? And that's something really different. I went into deep culture shock moving west and really trying to understand this collaborative way without people wanting something in return. That was quite an adjustment.
Now you come from a conservative Republican background, Ileana Ross-Layton,
Yeah.
Senator Mack, George H.W. Bush, the Independent Women's Forum. Is it tough to be a conservative Republican in Silicon Valley?
No, it's not. I say that people care about issues more so than politics per se. I did a briefing on Capitol Hill earlier, and it's just the questions kept coming up, how can Washington get more engaged in Silicon Valley? And my response was, stay out. They don't want you there. Just allow them to continue to do what they do best, which is technology, and an output of that is innovation. So there is great concern for the environment and cleaning water and fixing problems that billions of people are affected to, in addition to recognizing that there's an authenticity in the way that things are done there. So the value is really placed on following through on your passion, which has nothing to do with politics.
Does Silicon Valley in general, and I hate to generalize like that, but does Silicon Valley pay attention to what's going on in Washington?
No. And if you looked back recently, yes, there is a presence by some of the bigger companies overall. But, I think some of the greatest challenges, I wrote an op-ed about this in the Wall Street Journal this past week, was really about what gets in the way, what are the barriers to innovation? So it could be these patent trolls and the fact that Cisco has to now spend $50 million. Mark Chandler, the general counsel of Cisco, was here a few weeks ago to testify on Capitol Hill about that. That's $50 million of what they now consider an innovation tax fighting litigation, then that could be rather put into research and development. And so, there's not a great interest in Washington. There's more about how to move the needle forward. They really look to the east rather than to the west.
Did your Washington experience help you in Silicon Valley?
Only in the sense of I developed a thick skin, and as an entrepreneur, clearly you need a thick skin, but those skills don't really transfer very well. Just learning, I was schooled in the art of war, and that just is not the way that Silicon Valley operates. It is more about how can I help you rather than you don't have to be my enemy. And what was really interesting to me is sometimes competitors will actually, figure out a creative way to partner together, to have them proselytize their product or their ideas, to validate it and to give it credibility. So it was quite uniquely a dichotomy from where I came from.
You talk about innovation versus invention in Silicon Valley. What do you mean?
Well, what I mean by that is countries that are often concerned with trying to replicate Silicon Valley will think that they need to be Silicon Valley. And invention is the big idea. But invention comes very, very, we are definitely going through an exponential time. But that exponential time is based on innovation, really improving upon what's already existing out there. And that's really the distinction. Invention is just a new concept, a completely disruptive technology, versus innovation can be as simple in terms of just proving upon processes in your own local community. So I tell these jurisdictions that I sometimes consult to now that really you should be just looking to improve upon things. LA, Los Angeles was trying to fix its traffic problem, and so they just spent about $450 million synchronizing lights. That's innovation, and so it doesn't have to be this brand new disruptive technology.
Back to Stanford, Deborah Piscione. You write in Secrets of Silicon Valley that professors are encouraged or are allowed to be paid consultants to businesses.
Yes.
Is that an unusual?
It is unusual. I understand it's done more so now, but originally Stanford did come up with this concept because, again, it was about having greater connectivity to what was truly going on in the business world. And this all dates back to Leland Stanford. I mean, that need to really understand how to best prepare students can only be done through this seamless system and having this exposure. And Stanford also has an extremely strong licensing department. And because of that, innovations or inventions such as Google have profited dramatically because it was actually Larry Page who went to the licensing office and said, I need to patent this, I need to shop this around. The intention was not necessarily to build a company initially. And so the benefit to Stanford is that they now claim that over 6,000 companies have come out of Stanford, whether it's the company itself or a business plan was created there. And fiscally, financially, they benefit tremendously. I mean, Stanford made, just off of its equity investment in Google, made $336 million alone in royalty income. So, not bad.
Speaking of Google, is Google the giant in Silicon Valley?
I think there's many giants. I have to say I'm incredibly partial to Google, only in the sense that I think what they did was not only adopt the Silicon Valley culture, but then they massively expanded it. And what's so interesting to me, I mean, there's two sides of thought. They were willing to do whatever they could to create this incredible creative environment for people to flourish and work within. And so whether it was their 20% rule where they allowed people to have a day a week to do whatever they want, whether it was adopting more of the Silicon Valley lifestyle into the workplace. So now, when we first arrived at Google, I saw that campus for the first time and I thought, wow, it's so colorful. This is crazy. It's 2 stories. How could anybody take it so seriously? Now they've expanded way beyond that, and you go to the campus of Google and you're going to get run over by, bicycles or rollerblades or some new fun outdoor activity. And it's just allowing people to have some freedom to be creative. It's not about, sitting in a cubicle from 8 to 6 and trying to ignite innovation in that environment.
And you write in Secrets of Silicon Valley some of the perks of working at Google: on-site massages, razor scooters, rollerblades,
free food. Some of the best food you've ever had. Yeah, it's really look. I mean, you can make the counter argument that some people think it's designed to keep people there. When you can get your oil changed and your hair cut and your doctor's appointments. But the bottom line is, it allows people to get all of those hassles, all of those daily needs done in the course of their workday, so that when they are home with their families, they can spend that quality time together.
Deborah Piscione, you applied for a job at Google.
I did.
You went for an interview.
I did.
And you write about that.
Yeah, I did. It was, I wasn't purposely planning on applying for a job, but my resume did end up on the desk of someone there, and next thing I knew, I got a call from Human Resources and started going through that very onerous process where what Google does is it gets multiple people engaged in different departments to have to greenlight you to go to that next stage. And then the final stage, which I actually wrote that I did not make, was they would have looked at my GPAs and my SAT scores.
From 100 years? Well,
yeah,
for
right,
you, 10 years
exactly.
ago. But for some people.
No, from 100 years ago. Absolutely. Yeah, which was a little daunting. But I do understand, trying to throw the most brilliant people in the room together. I'm not discrediting myself here, but there is a algorithm in the way that Google does everything. And hiring is part of that practice.
Does Washington understand Silicon Valley?
No, absolutely not. No. And, it's and I'm not sure it's supposed to, because I think Washington is trying to look at it from a perspective of sort of the industrial relic. You know, we still think outside of Silicon Valley, if you say the word entrepreneur, it's not necessarily well embraced. You know, it can be perceived as unemployed, not knowing what you want to do in life, or you're this small business owner. And nobody in Silicon Valley thinks of themselves as a small business owner. You know, you think whether you're going to build a company for 10 people or 10,000 people, you know, you really do have a very different startup mentality overall. So I think Washington is looking from certainly an economic standpoint. You know, we tend to look through the lens of economics and traditional monetary and fiscal policy. So I think there's a lot to learn to this third leg of the stool that Silicon Valley offers, which is culture and how culture can play into a regional economy.
You don't write about this, but could you compare Detroit and the car industry to Silicon Valley and the differences, or are they alike?
No, I don't know that they're alike. I mean, it's been extraordinary. First of all, the one time I think Silicon Valley took in significant amount of money, that company failed. So that should show you something right there, Solantra. But, you know, no, I don't compare, and I don't want to claim that I know Detroit really well. I've only been there once. Certainly the turnaround with some of the companies has been fantastic, but what I think Detroit is doing is getting more in tune to the technologies of Silicon Valley. And I write in the book that it's more important to have an office in Silicon Valley than it is in New York or Washington, because if you don't pay attention to where technologies are heading, you're going to be looking at the same place Eastman Kodak did. You know, a multi-billion-dollar company that went out of business practically overnight without understanding where the technology was happening. And the iPhone really put Kodak Eastman out of business.
You write, governments around the world, most notably China, Russia, India, Norway, Taiwan, South Korea, and Finland, continuously send delegations to Silicon Valley to try to discover its secrets. Just stand in the middle of the Arbuckle Dining Pavilion in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, and you'll hear a myriad of languages spoken among the foreign delegates, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it is remarkable. I mean, it's actually very exciting, and it's not just limited to the business school. I mean, you can be, my 7-year-old twin boys took a math class in the math building at Stanford because, again, they offer these opportunities for surrounding children. And you could be standing there, and I think their class was from 6 to 8 on a Thursday night, and you will see busloads of Chinese tourists, you know, just marching, parading into the main quad with cameras everywhere. It's a must-stop place on their, you know, tour of the Bay Area. And now I understand why, and it truly is something to learn from.
Why did you move out there?
Originally, it was my husband's job. He had a job transfer, but it was my work that has now kept us there.
And you've started a couple of companies. What are they?
I did.
And how did you begin them?
You know, really by default, but it is I think, not necessarily a typical Silicon Valley story, but certainly one that you hear often. I wanted to figure out what the whole startup world was about. I wasn't real familiar with it, and ended up working at another startup when I first moved out there, and kind of just took a back seat, and I thought, well, this is really interesting, the way they work, because again, there was much more open dialogue and transparency than I was used to. The CEO would literally disclose all the terms of how the company was doing. And that was really interesting to me, but unfortunately that particular company went belly up, but the investor from that company came to my co-founder and I and said, I like you guys, figure out something to do and I'll fund you. And it was literally an initial $250,000 investment with no business plan, not much of a vision, not sure where we were going. He was an engineer. You know, I had a content background, and we thought, let's kind of bridge this together and see what happens. So we developed Betty Confidential, which became one of the leading magazine websites for women. And out of that, a couple years later, we built the Alley to the Valley community, which is a leading community for women in entrepreneurship and private equity and venture capital, and really for the purposes of deal flow. But we eventually opened that up as well, just to recognize that in order to have deal flow, that a lot of women really needed to be at the table to be able to participate. And then lastly, I got absolutely fascinated in where science was heading and realized after spending time at Singularity University for the research of this book that I needed to change the school where my kids were attending. And I was fascinated by these future sciences in artificial intelligence and robotics, nanotechnology, and felt that there needed to be some sort of gaming around the way particularly boys and kids like to play, but having them get exposure to where these future technologies lie, because our academic system is so trapped in a 20th century workforce, and we wanted to provide some exposure to what the 21st century workforce
What is
was going to look like.
Singularity University?
Singularity University is probably one of the most remarkable places I've been to. It is housed out of Moffett Field. It has been co-founded between Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil, two of the great futurist thinkers. And what Peter really wanted to do was bring together the world's leading scientists, technologists, entrepreneurs under one roof and figure out how to join together to best serve these exponential technologies with particular focus on the greatest needs in the world. You know, how do we get clean water? How do we get clean air? And they have their areas of discipline and have really brought together numerous people around the world, not just for the purposes of a four-year traditional university, which it is not. It's more for an executive education program for entrepreneurs in between entrepreneurship and more executive learning over longer periods of time, where executives can come from very traditional companies and learn what innovation is all about.
We only have a few minutes left. You write, upon moving here to Silicon Valley, we were told that it was easy to meet people, but it was hard to get to know them.
Yeah, it was. It's an entrenched, community. On the one hand, it was incredibly open because I'd be standing in line at Starbucks or wherever, at the bank, at the grocery store, and people would just talk to you, and introduce themselves and find out you were new to town and ask who you could meet. But at the same time, there is a little bit of an entrenched community around Stanford. So you're an alumni of Stanford or you're an alumni of this company. But it is this tight collaboration that makes Silicon Valley what it is, because so much of it is built on these relationships that either came out of Stanford or existing companies. So it takes a little time to find your rhythm there.
What's the downside to Silicon Valley?
Well, I think if you would, there's a lot of concern with the socioeconomic status. It's an incredibly expensive place to live. I write about just the astronomical cost of housing. The Economist had an interesting article a couple months ago blaming the housing cost of Silicon Valley on the entire world crisis, because they felt if more people could enter into Silicon Valley, we would have more technologies and more advancement and more opportunity for people to get engaged in this very muscular economy that Silicon Valley offers. And the question I will always have is there a point when there's too much technology, there's too much availability, there's too much exposure? Because once that's out there, you can't go backwards. That's it.
Deborah Piscione is the author. Secrets of Silicon Valley is the book, currently number 3 on the Wall Street Journal's bestseller list. What everyone else can learn from the innovation capital of the world. This is The Communicators on C-SPAN.